So if you're grinding through like a 2-hour Sunday study session right now to master advanced English, neuroscience actually shows you might be wasting your time.
Yeah, completely wasting it, honestly.
Right, because the secret to C1 fluency isn't, binge studying until your eyes glaze over. It's actually exactly what you are doing right this second.
Exactly. Taking like 10 or 15 minutes while you're walking the dog or sitting in traffic or, I don't know, folding laundry.
Yeah, folding laundry is a big one. Just feeding your brain high density, complex concepts while your body is in motion.
Because the mechanics of how the human brain consolidates language, it's um, it's deeply tied to that kind of consistent active integration. Like binge learning creates short-term recognition, sure, but tackling advanced vocabulary in short daily bursts, that wires those concepts directly into your long-term memory.
Wow.
Yeah, you literally build neurological pathways that allow you to actually think in the language rather than just constantly translating it in your head.
Which is huge. And that actually brings us perfectly to our mission for today's deep dive. We are taking 10 incredibly powerful words and analyzing the mechanics of how they function in high-level English.
We're moving way beyond those basic B2 translations you'd find in a pocket dictionary.
Right, because upgrading to a C1 level, it's kind of like switching your worldview from standard definition to 4K resolution. Suddenly, everything is just sharp.
Oh, I love that analogy. It's so true.
Thanks. So the words we are unpacking today, and you might want to mentally bookmark these, are abolish, abortion, absence, absent, absurd, abundance, abuse, academy, accelerate, and acceptance.
That is a heavy list.
It really is, because these aren't just vocabulary words, they're foundational concepts that shape global politics and, structural inequality and human psychology.
Right. Because when you encounter these terms in high-level media or academic journals, they're rarely just describing a simple action. They carry, the weight of societal frameworks. They basically describe the invisible architecture of how human beings organize themselves, govern each other, and deal with the inevitable friction of coexisting.
So let's test that architecture with our first word, which carries an immense amount of historical gravity. And that word is abolish. Now, a B2 learner might look at that and think, oh, it just means to cancel or to stock something.
Yeah, which is a common mistake.
Right. But in a C1 context, substituting the word cancel for abolish completely strips away the power of the sentence.
Because you don't merely, stop an institution.
Yeah.
To abolish something is to systematically dismantle its legal or structural foundation.
Yeah.
I mean, the etymology stems from the Latin for destroying or, retarding growth.
It's permanent.
Exactly. When we see this in advanced text, it's almost exclusively reserved for deeply entrenched systemic practices. For instance, you'll read sociological essays debating the movement to abolish the death penalty.
Because the argument presented there is typically that no justice system is infallible enough to wield an irreversible punishment.
Right.
So the word itself implies that the thing being destroyed was previously formalized. Like, you couldn't abolish a bad habit, right? You wouldn't abolish your late-night chocolate habit.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Because a habit isn't an institution. You abolish slavery. You abolish child labor. The word communicates a massive collective shift in societal ethics.
It's the formal tearing up of a social contract.
Precisely. And speaking of ending processes before they reach their natural conclusion, that brings us to an incredibly potent word in legal, medical, and even technical texts, and that is abortion.
Now, as a linguistic focal point, this word is fascinating because of how much space it occupies in advanced political discourse. And just to be completely clear to everyone listening, we are entirely impartial here. We are not taking any political sides whatsoever.
Absolutely not. Our goal is strictly linguistic and analytical.
Exactly, because in reading high-level commentary, the context typically frames this not just as a medical procedure, the termination of a pregnancy, but as the ultimate philosophical battleground regarding bodily autonomy versus the role of the state.
Right. Impartially analyzing how the word functions in a sentence reveals that it's really the epicenter of how modern societies define individual rights. The texts you encounter at a C1 level use the debate surrounding this word to explore where the jurisdiction of a government ends and the sovereignty of an individual begins.
It's profound.
It is. But what makes the term structurally interesting in the English language is its broader mechanical application, because it denotes any deliberate cessation of a process.
Like in aerospace engineering, right? Or military operations, you frequently hear commanders or technicians refer to an aborted mission.
Yes, a trajectory cut short. If a spacecraft detects, like an anomaly in its thrusters, the automated systems will initiate an abort sequence. It's the conscious decision to terminate an objective because the parameters for success or safety are no longer viable.
Okay. That concept of violating parameters or crossing a line feeds perfectly into our third word, which also sits right on the fault line of societal trust. And that word is abuse.
In everyday conversation, we generally associate abuse with cruel or violent treatment, whether physical or emotional.
Right.
But as you move into corporate literature or political science or legal documents, the word takes on a systemic identity. It refers to the deliberate exploitation of power or resources.
Wait, I actually want to clarify the nuance here. What is the actual difference between an abuse of power and just being, a terribly incompetent leader? Like if a CEO makes a disastrous financial decision that bankrupts a company, is that an abuse of power?
Not necessarily. Incompetence is a failure of ability. Abuse is a failure of integrity.
Oh, that's a good distinction.
Right. It requires a framework of trust and then the conscious manipulation of that framework for personal gain. So if the CEO makes a bad investment, that's incompetence. But if the CEO uses corporate funds to secretly pay off personal debts, that is an abuse of authority.
Because the framework, like the company's expense policy, was exploited.
Exactly. And that distinction completely changes how you read the news. It means whenever you see the word abuse in an investigative journalism piece, the author is signaling that a system was manipulated from the inside.
Wow. So the overarching theme connecting abolish, abort, and abuse is really the breaking down of order.
Yeah. These are the words we use when human systems fail, when boundaries are crossed, or when old structures just have to be cleared away.
So if those words represent the tearing down of tangible frameworks, what happens when there is no framework left? Because the fallout of a broken system is usually a void, which transitions us to our next set of concepts, absence and absent.
Right. So absence, the noun form, is fundamentally the state of something not being there. But in advanced reasoning, particularly in scientific and philosophical literature, absence takes on a mass of its own. It becomes an active variable.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Consider the famous maxim popularized by the astrophysicist Carl Sagan. He said, "The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence."
Oh, I love that quote. Meaning, like, just because a probe hasn't photographed a microbe on Mars yet doesn't mean the entire planet is utterly sterile forever. The void of data doesn't prove the void of life.
Exactly. Or, in geopolitical analysis, an author might write that the absence of mutual trust renders a peace treaty impossible. The text isn't describing a physical barrier. It's describing a psychological vacuum that exerts a gravitational pull on the negotiations. It actively prevents progress.
That makes the adjective form absent feel so much more layered. Obviously, a student can be physically absent from a classroom, but the C1 application of the word often describes a profound cognitive disconnect, like having an absent expression.
Yeah.
I picture my own brain during a really dense spreadsheet presentation on a Monday morning. Mentally, I am getting the spinning beach ball of death, like the physical hardware is sitting in the chair, but the background processes are completely overloaded and the main screen is entirely frozen.
That is a rather vivid illustration of cognitive decoupling. I think we've all been there.
Oh, absolutely.
But what happens when you are fully present, yet the system around you completely lacks logical cohesion? That brings us to a crucial analytical term: absurd.
To call something absurd is to say it is ridiculously unreasonable. Just the complete breakdown of logic.
And it goes deeper than merely being silly.
Yeah.
In C1 literature, absurdity frequently describes a paradox that traps human beings. Imagine a bureaucratic loop where an agency demands you present a valid passport to apply for a birth certificate.
Okay.
But then they require the birth certificate to issue the passport.
Ugh, yes. The system functions perfectly according to its own rules, but the rules themselves are completely detached from reality. It's like it's a feature, not a bug, of the bureaucracy.
Exactly. And this realization actually became the foundation for an entire post-World War II philosophical and literary movement. It was known as the theater of the absurd.
Wait, really? Like an actual theater movement?
Yes. Playwrights like Samuel Beckett, they captured the profound disillusionment of the 20th century. After witnessing the systematic destruction of global war, artists felt that human existence itself was inherently meaningless.
Wow.
And they felt that our desperate attempts to find clear, rational logic in a totally indifferent universe would just inevitably fail.
Like characters in a play waiting endlessly for someone who never arrives, right?
Yeah.
Just having circular conversations to pass the time. But let me ask you this from a psychological perspective. Is labeling a political or corporate system as absurd actually a defense mechanism.
Oh, you mean?
Like, does laughing at the sheer absurdity of a broken DMV process protect us from the pain of its absence of logic?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Psychologically, labeling a situation as absurd is a highly effective cognitive reframing tool. If you operate under the rigid expectation that human institutions will always be rational, you will experience constant distress when they inevitably fail.
That makes a lot of sense.
Acknowledging the absurdity allows you to distance yourself emotionally. You stop trying to force the square peg into the round hole, and instead, you just observe the bizarre nature of the pegs themselves.
And as anyone who is listening to this daily deep dive can attest, observing those systems doesn't mean we just passively surrender to them. Humans possess a relentless drive to construct new models, to figure out how to navigate the absurdity, which naturally introduces our next trio of words: academy, accelerate, and abundance.
So, if absurdity is the breakdown of meaning, an academy is our attempt to institutionalize it. The word actually originates from the Grove of Academus, where Plato founded his school of philosophy in ancient Greece.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And today, graduating from using the word school to academy in a C1 text, it implies a sanctuary of specialized excellence.
You see it in high-level policy proposals all the time. Like, a municipal government won't just talk about fixing local education. They'll propose transforming failing districts into specialized science and technology academies. It elevates the institution from a place of basic instruction to a crucible of targeted expertise.
Exactly. And the primary function of an academy, in a societal sense, is to accelerate human capability, to alter the rate of change.
And the word accelerate is so often confined to physical speed in lower-level English, like a car accelerating on a highway. But in advanced discourse, it almost exclusively refers to the collapsing of timelines.
Right. Consider the literature analyzing the sociological impact of the 2020 pandemic. Sociologists repeatedly state that the crisis accelerated the global shift to remote work infrastructure by at least a decade.
It's true. It took the agonizingly slow curve of corporate policy changes and basically compressed 10 years of debate into, 10 weeks of frantic implementation?
Yes. Another prominent example in current economic texts is the transition to green energy. Capital investment in renewable infrastructure is accelerating due to a confluence of policy mandates and plummeting production costs.
So the timeline for replacing fossil fuels is compressing.
Precisely. And when systems accelerate effectively, they theoretically produce conditions of abundance, which is the conceptual opposite of scarcity.
Having a surplus,
Yeah.
having more than enough to go around.
But the C1 application usually leans heavily into behavioral economics and psychology. You'll frequently encounter the term abundance mindset. It's a cognitive framework suggesting that an individual views the world as possessing limitless opportunities, resources, and connections. It's a direct rejection of the zero-sum game mentality, where one person's success inherently requires another person's failure.
Okay, I have to challenge the utility of that mindset, though. In a practical sense, isn't an abundance mindset just a repackaged form of toxic positivity, especially when we just discussed systemic abuse and the necessity to abolish historically unjust structures? I read a macroeconomic analysis recently pointing out that economic abundance in one hemisphere does absolutely nothing to reduce poverty in another, purely due to the friction of distribution channels and geopolitical hoarding. So, isn't walking around with an abundance mindset slightly absurd?
That is a really sharp critique.
Right.
And honestly, if the mindset is used to deny empirical reality, then yes, it is toxic.
Right.
However, the psychological literature distinguishes between physical resources and cognitive resources. An abundance mindset isn't the delusion that everyone have enough food. It's the internal belief that collaboration yields higher dividends than isolation.
Oh, I see the distinction.
Yeah, leaders operating from a paradigm of fear and scarcity, they'll hoard resources and build walls. But leaders operating from abundance will build academies and share intellectual property because they believe the resulting innovations will expand the pie for everyone.
So the mindset acts as the internal fuel required to accelerate external physical changes. It's basically a prerequisite for systemic generosity.
A necessary precondition for progress, exactly. And this is actually a great time to remind you, the listener, why this matters. Just listening to this kind of breakdown for 10 minutes a day while you're commuting or exercising, this is how you build an abundance of vocabulary. You don't need hours a day, you just need consistency. So definitely subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss your daily session.
Absolutely. Because to truly operate from a place of abundance, one must first master the final and arguably most complex concept on our vocabulary list today: And that is acceptance.
On the surface, the formal definition feels very administrative.
Hmm.
Agreeing to receive something,
Hmm.
like a university acceptance letter or the acceptance of a diplomatic treaty.
But the psychological and sociological depth of the word is where its true power lies in C1 fluency. It signifies a profound willingness to embrace a reality without futile resistance.
Right. The clinical term for this is radical acceptance, which is heavily utilized in modern behavioral therapy. The underlying philosophy is that human suffering is heavily compounded not just by a painful reality, but by the exhaustive mental energy we spend demanding that the reality should be different.
It's the cognitive equivalent of dropping the rope in a tug of war against the
I
universe.
love that visual. Yes.
Yes.
Practicing radical acceptance does not indicate approval of a traumatic event or an unjust system. It simply means you start burning your internal fuel, litigating the unchangeable past. You accept that the pieces are where they are on the board, which is literally the only way you can strategically plan your next move.
It's about cognitive conservation. Like, you cannot navigate a ship out of a hurricane if you are standing on the deck, expending all your energy screaming at the clouds for raining. You accept the storm and you grab the wheel. And culturally speaking, lasting change relies entirely on this mechanism. You can pass a piece of legislation overnight, sure, but the actual integration of a new ethical standard requires the slow, generational acceptance of new values across millions of minds.
Because true systemic evolution always trails behind the legislation.
Wow. We have dissected some incredibly dense linguistic and cultural architecture today, but to truly lock this into the listener's long-term memory, we need to observe all these structural components operating simultaneously. So I'm going to challenge you.
Oh boy.
I want to see if you can weave all 10 of these C1 concepts into a single cohesive paragraph that analyzes the human condition.
Okay, let us construct the architecture. Give me a second.
Take your time.
All right, here we go. In a modern era defined by technological abundance, it remains profoundly absurd that global citizens still endure the daily abuse of power and the glaring absence of basic, dignified living conditions. Those in positions of authority can no longer remain cognitively absent from the consequences of their policies. Instead, society must invest in new academies of ethical thought to consciously accelerate humanitarian progress. Ultimately, this paradigm shift requires a radical acceptance of our collective historical failures before we can successfully abolish systemic inequality, ensuring that our pursuit of justice does not become an abortion of the very ideals we claim to uphold.
Boom. That is a masterclass in syntax. Every single word carrying its full structural weight.
Thank you. I think I got them all.
You did. And listen, if you are listening to this right now, walking your route, or sitting in the driver's seat, and you intuitively grasp the flow of that paragraph, you are actively experiencing neurological adaptation.
Your brain is mapping the context, linking the philosophical weight to the mechanical definition.
This is exactly why taking just 10 minutes a day to immerse yourself in this level of discourse is the ultimate shortcut to fluency. You don't need to block out hours of your weekend to stare at flashcards. The consistency of this daily habit will elevate your English far faster than any cram session ever could.
Absolutely.
So, before you finish your walk or reach your destination, do yourself a favor. Hit subscribe on the feed and ensure your notifications are turned on. Let your phone remind you to take your daily dose of intellectual deep diving.
Because we will be right here unpacking the architecture of language every single day.
To close out today's session, I want to leave you with a philosophical paradox to chew on. We spent a lot of time analyzing radical acceptance, that psychological necessity of letting go of our resistance to unchangeable realities, to conserve our mental energy and find peace.
Right.
But we also examined the moral imperative to abolish structures that are fundamentally unjust, which is an act fueled entirely by a refusal to accept the status quo. So where exactly is the line drawn?
That's the big question.
If profound acceptance brings internal peace, but fierce, unyielding outrage fuels the abolition of broken systems, how do you balance the two? Where is the boundary between radically accepting reality so you don't lose your mind and fighting against it so you don't lose your soul? Something to analyze while you finish your commute. We will catch you next time on The Deep Dive.